Let's move on. The BLM protest, again, that was kind of where we got our start. This is kind of an interesting story to share with you. I want to make sure that I get to as much as I can, so I'm going to start. This is from CBS News. The FBI worked to undermine racial justice protests and other actions in Denver in 2020, a new podcast alleges. This is an older article, so forgive it how it sounds, but we're going to bring it up to date. Quote, sorry, no, it's not a quote. Alphabet Boys, that's the name of the show. Alphabet Boys, a 10-episode documentary podcast from Western Sound and iHeart Podcast, debuted Tuesday and details efforts from the FBI to infiltrate and undermine the racial justice movement following the police killing of George Floyd. The podcast is based on hours of secret FBI undercover recordings regarding a paid informant who allegedly encouraged violence and destruction and attempted to set up unsuspecting activists in crimes. Quote, federal law enforcement caused violence and destruction in the summer of 2020, unquote, said Zeb Hall, a racial justice activist in Denver, whose story is told in the podcast. Goes on to say the FBI's informant was a criminal who pushed activists toward violence as part of an attempt by the federal government to undermine our political movement from within, unquote. The podcast alleges, among other things, the following. The FBI recruited Mickey Windecker, a violent felon with a sexual assault conviction, and paid him tens of thousands of dollars during the summer of 2020 to pose as a racial justice activist. The informant became a leader in the Denver racial justice movement and promoted protests that turned violent and destructive. As part of this effort, the FBI went on to try to set up a racial justice activist in Colorado Springs. A spokesperson for the FBI's Denver field office declined to comment for the story and referred questions to the FBI's national office. The FBI's national press office did not respond to a request for comment. A, quote, one-time non-confidential human source payment receipt, unquote, shared with CBS News Colorado appears to show a payment of $500 from the FBI to Windecker in 2020. This is CNN's words. They say that they reviewed the document but were unable to confirm it. Additional reporting from the podcast producers, which include leaked documents, undercover recordings, and interviews with Colorado-based protesters who interacted with Windecker, identified him, podcast producers said. Colorado court records show felony convictions for assault and menacing, among other charges, as well as a protection order against Windecker granted in a sexual assault case. One phone number listed for Windecker was disconnected. A text message seeking comment to another was met with a wrong number response. CBS News Colorado did not receive a response to an email listed as belonging to Windecker. Now, that's the CBS article. I want to share a supplementary social media clip that I think tells a little bit more about what was going on here. So here we go.
The FBI hired an informant to infiltrate the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests, instigate violence, and entrap activists in crimes, according to an investigative journalist. Informant Michael Windecker was reportedly paid at least $20,000 to spy on protesters in Denver and turn peaceful protests into violent ones. He gained the trust of protesters and eventually became a leader in the movement, and accused the real leaders of working with the authorities while also setting up others to be arrested. Trevor Aronson is the host of the podcast Alphabet Boys, which covers how the FBI infiltrated racial justice protests in the summer of 2020. Aronson says the FBI used counterterrorism tactics against protesters.
The FBI used informants or undercover agents to put together terrorism plots that then they could attract people to be a part of, then foil them and announce to the public a terrorism plot foiled. It had been theory that I'd had that they were using these types of tactics that had been perfected during the War on Terror against protesters, but I couldn't prove it. It was something that I was searching for evidence of, and then finally a source was able to provide me with these records and these recordings that showed how the FBI had taken a violent felon and used him as an informant.
The tactics are similar to another program that the FBI used from the 1950s to the early 70s called the Counterintelligence Program, or COINTELPRO. Under COINTELPRO, the FBI used informants to discredit, spy on, and disrupt political and civil rights organizations in the U.S. Targets included the Black Panther Party, the American Indian Movement, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The intelligence was used to break up marriages, disrupt meetings, cast out people from their professions, and provoke targeted groups into conflicts that in some cases even resulted in death. In 1976, the actions taken under COINTELPRO were found to be illegal, and reforms were passed to regulate government surveillance and internal guidelines. But that all changed after 9/11.
The FBI was granted enormous powers post 9/11 to pursue and find would-be terrorists. And 20 years later, what we're finding is that many of those powers and practices are now being applied against political activists and non-terrorists.
With its restored powers, the FBI was able to have its informant infiltrate the Denver racial justice movement. The Bureau incentivized Vindecker to manufacture crimes that Aronson explained likely would have never happened without his disruption. Vindecker eventually went so far as to try and get activists to assassinate the Attorney General of Colorado, but none of them would go along with it.
And so in the case of Denver, what we have is an informant going in, spying on Americans who are not committing crimes, and then also encouraging Americans to commit violence that without the government's agent, they likely would not have done at all. Would there have been as much violence were it not for the government agent pushing for that violence and encouraging that violence? That's not something we can fully measure, but I do think it's quite troubling that we even have to ask the question, how much of the government's behavior in an undercover capacity resulted in some of the violence that we saw.
We got a couple of minutes. Any reflections, Q?
Rams, you have to ask yourself why something like COINTELPRO was so problematic. And I think what happened post 9/11 answers that question for us, right? Like expanding the government's powers, resources, reach, accessibility in the name of public safety, in the name of national security, because they know that a people will surrender its freedoms to feel safe. It's the same reason why research shows in neighborhoods, even neighborhoods that are black, where black people are violently unarmed and killed by police, those same communities still vote for more police because they think that means more safe. So using the guise of national security, governments have been able to take advantage of its citizens and have its citizens lay down its rights to privacy and allow more access in the name of safety. And why they do that is so straightforward and so unsurprising, right? Like the article that you read and the audio that we heard, they both tell the story for us. These are things that we knew, but they're given more credibility. So we're not treated like paranoid fearmongers. These things really happened. And the government funded spying on its own citizens, creating the problem, solving the problem, and then pointing to it as something that they've done heroic or that we should celebrate or be proud of. Sadly, tactics like this work.
Yeah, the same thing can be said about, Dr. King and the Panthers and Malcolm X. And, I know they had files on, Angela Davis. And, that's a long list of people that got chased out of this country, or, James Baldwin ended up moving overseas and, all that sort of stuff. When people say that we have a victim complex or we're imagining things, it's kind of crazy. And they think that all that happened was slavery and the war on drugs. And it's like, there's so much in between that they're not considering. And the fact that it's still happening is wild. But we're doing what we can, which is telling people the truth.